The village of Stavishche, Ukraine, 1933. Men and women who were once farmers, people who had literally fed an entire empire, were now wandering the streets, bodies swollen from starvation, too weak to walk straight. One survivor described it years later. You could see them walking about, just walking, and one would drop, and then another, and so on it went. At the village hospital, overwhelmed doctors couldn't keep up with the bodies. They carried them out on stretchers and dropped them into enormous pits. Not graves, pits. And here is the detail that makes this story unlike most famines in history. There was no drought, no blight, no crop failure. Ukraine was called the breadbasket of Europe for a reason. The food existed. The famine was built deliberately, methodically by one man sitting in Moscow, Joseph Stalin. This is the Holodomor, and it is one of the most carefully covered up mass killings of the 20th century. To understand why Stalin would starve millions of his own citizens, you have to understand what he wanted and what Ukraine represented to him. By 1929, Stalin had launched what he called collectivization. The plan was simple, at least on paper. No more private farms. Every farm in the Soviet Union would now belong to the state. Farmers would surrender their land, their livestock, their grain, and their tools. In exchange, they would receive the honor of serving the communist state. Generous. Ukraine's farmers were not impressed. They resisted. They slaughtered their own livestock rather than hand it over. They hid grain beneath floorboards and inside walls. They refused. And Stalin, being Stalin, decided that the appropriate response to this stubbornness was to declare them enemies of the state. He used the word kulaks, supposedly meaning wealthy peasants exploiting the poor. In practice, it meant anyone who didn't comply. Families were dragged off their land. Stalin's secret police drew up plans to deport 50,000 Ukrainian farm families to Siberia, just removed. But confiscation and deportation still weren't enough for him, because Ukraine wasn't just another Soviet region. Stalin genuinely feared Ukrainian nationalism, the idea that Ukrainians might see themselves as a distinct people, separate from Russia, with their own language, culture, and identity. He wanted to turn Ukraine into a model Soviet republic, which in his vocabulary meant a Ukraine that had forgotten it was Ukrainian. Simultaneously, teachers, writers, artists, anyone who embodied Ukrainian cultural life were being systematically arrested or killed. The famine that was coming wasn't only about grain quotas. It was about erasing a people's sense of themselves. If you think that's a strong claim, drop a comment right now and tell me, do you think the Holodomor was a genocide or a terrible policy gone wrong? Because historians still argue about this, and your answer might tell you more about how we judge power than you'd expect. By the fall of 1932, Ukraine's grain harvest was already going to miss Stalin's target by 60%. There were still enough reserves for the population to barely survive. What happened next is where any argument about unintended policy consequences starts to collapse under its own weight. Stalin issued an order: confiscate everything. Not just grain, vegetables, beans, salt, any caloric substance that could keep a human being alive was stripped from Ukrainian homes by Soviet officials. A December 1932 document ordered party cadres to extract even more grain from regions that had already failed their quotas. Officials who resisted or moved too slowly were arrested. Entire villages that fell short of their numbers were placed on a blacklist, meaning no goods of any kind could enter. And here is the detail that makes even careful historians pause. Blockades were established not only to keep food out of Ukraine, but to prevent starving Ukrainians from leaving. They were sealed inside the starvation zone. Those caught trying to flee were sent back or shot. Now, at this exact moment, the New York Times was publishing cheerful reports from Moscow. Walter Duranty, their star correspondent, had won a Pulitzer Prize in 1932 for his coverage of Stalin's Soviet Union. He dismissed accounts of famine as exaggeration. He said there was no actual starvation. He described the dead and dying Ukrainian peasants as malcontents. Meanwhile, British journalist Gareth Jones had physically walked through the villages. He had seen the bodies in the fields. He had published the truth. Almost nobody listened because Durante had the Pulitzer, and Durante said it wasn't happening. It is also worth mentioning, because history demands it, that while millions of Ukrainians were dying in the fields, the Soviet government continued exporting Ukrainian harvested grain to foreign markets to finance Stalin's industrialization drive. The grain existed. The government decided where it went, and it did not go to the people who grew it. By the time the famine lifted in 1933, between 3.5 and 5 million Ukrainians were dead. Some estimates reach as high as 7 to 10 million. Ukraine had lost approximately 13% of its entire population in under 2 years. The Kuban region of Russia, where a large Ukrainian population lived, saw its Ukrainian community fall from 915,000 people in 1926 to 150,000 by 1939. The Soviet government then banned any discussion of the famine for decades. Inside the USSR, mentioning the Holodomor was classified as anti-Soviet propaganda. The silence held until Gorbachev's glasnost policy in the 1980s finally cracked it open. Subscribe right now if you want more history that doesn't soften what actually happened, because there's one final piece of this that most people never hear. Today, the Holodomor is recognized as a genocide by Ukraine and 33 other countries. Russia has never recognized it as a genocide. In 2008, the Russian State Duma described the Soviet regime as one that neglected the lives of people for economic and political goals, which is one of the most diplomatically careful ways in recorded history to say your predecessors were mass murderers without technically saying it. The word Holodomor is Ukrainian. Holod means hunger. Mor comes from a root meaning plague or death. Together, death by hunger. Not famine, not food shortage. The language itself carries a verdict. The genocide debate still makes some historians uncomfortable because there is no document bearing Stalin's signature that explicitly orders the starvation of Ukrainians. What does exist, however, are documents ordering impossible quotas, documents ordering confiscation of all food, documents ordering blockades, documents ordering the arrest of anyone who objected, and documents ordering total silence about what was happening. That is not an absence of evidence. That is a paper trail, carefully constructed to avoid being a paper trail. The survivors who lived through the Holodomor largely didn't speak about it, not because it wasn't real, but because it had been declared officially unreal for so long that staying silent had become a habit of survival. And that silence outlasted the Soviet Union itself. The Holodomor didn't happen because a policy went wrong and no one noticed. It happened because a policy worked exactly as intended, and the most disturbing part of the whole story is how successfully the world was persuaded for so long that it never happened at all. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure you leave a like. Comment down below your thoughts on anything I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see more like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.